Good afternoon, everybody. So here we are again, and we're just going to sally forth. We're going to continue. We have a bit to cover, and I don't want to, we have to move on after today. We're going to have to move on from Ramanuja. So let's bring up our screen. Here we are. We got up to topic 8. The topic is from the second chapter of the Sri Bhasha. Up the top here, that's the name of Ramanuja's commentary. Okay, Bhasha means a commentary. So the different commentators name their commentaries. So Ramanuja's commentary is named the Shri. And the Shri is also actually the goddess Lakshmi. And it's the name of the Ramanuja lineage. Those of you that have been to India or perhaps, you might have seen this on TV, those that wear the sacred clay, which are 2 white lines, stripes going up this way with a red line in the middle, that is the Shri lineage. Shri is the name of the goddess Lakshmi. The lineage sort of identifies her as somehow as being the progenitor of the source of the Vishishtadvaita. Remember the name of so the Shri is the lineage, the Shri Vaishnava lineage. Vaishnavas are followers of Vishnu. There's several, different schools of Vaishnavism. One is the Shri Vaishnavism. That's Ramanuja, whose commentary we're reading. You can recognize them by the white clay with the red line in the middle. Now, the name of the philosopher, the name of the commentary on the Vedanta is the Sri Bhasha. Bhasha just means a commentary, the Sri Bhasha. Now, the name of the philosophy we've discussed several times is Vishishtadvaita, qualified non-dualism. Okay, it's got Ramanuja, the founder. Lineage is the Sri lineage, Sri Vaishnava. Ramanuja is the founder of the lineage. He writes a commentary called Sri Bhasha. He offers it to Sri, offers it to the goddess Lakshmi. And his philosophy is called Vishishtadvaita. Okay, so there's a few different terms, all overlap, but they all have their specific meanings. Right, let's jump in. Topic 8. The topic is Brahman, though destitute of materials and instruments, is yet the cause of the world. Okay, right, he has no materials to work with, no instruments, because in the beginning there was just Brahman, right? There was nothing else. So the objector, here's the objector. This topic has begun to refute the objection that without extraneous aids, Brahman cannot be the cause through mere volition, right? If I want to make something, I want to make my pot. Remember, the pot's always our example. Well, I need a potter's wheel. I need a stick to poke in the pot. I need instruments. So that's going to be refuted. Brahman does not need instruments. If it be said that Brahman, without extraneous aids, instruments and such, cannot be the cause of the world, because an agent is seen to collect materials for any construction, right? You want to do construction, you have to collect, tools, equipment, materials. We say no, since it's like milk turning into curds. Milk turns into curds without any need of any extraneous equipment. Okay, so a fresh objection is raised against the Vedanta position. Vedanta has to defend this. The objection is raised against this Vedanta position that Brahman being the cause of the world, right? Because in the text, start off with always quoting the scripture, the Shruti, the Upanishads say, being alone was this before creation, one only without a second, there was nothing else, no instruments, no equipment, right? Says the opponent in the Chandogya. So besides Brahman, there was nothing extraneous. It is ordinarily seen that even agents who are capable of creating something have to take the help of extraneous materials, instruments, etc. As for example, a potter, back to our potter, has to take the help of clay and the potter's wheel. In the old days, there was a potter's wheel. When I went to school, we went to pottery class, we had the wheel, maybe they still do, to create a pot. So Brahman, being without a second, has not the accessories. He's got nothing. And so he can't be the creator of the variegated world. That's the objector. And Ramanuja responds. This sutra refutes that objection by showing that such a thing is possible. Just as milk turns into curd without the help of extraneous things. But notice he doesn't allow Sāṃkhya to say that. Sāṃkhya wants to say that about pradhana. Remember, Vedanta says, no, there's got to be intelligence behind it. Sāṃkhya says, no, we don't. They used this example. Milk transforms into curd without intelligence. So they don't allow, they resist it when Sāṃkhya uses that example, but they use it for Ishvara, for Brahma. So it is not always necessary to have the aid of accessories in creating a thing. Therefore, Brahman also without accessories can be the cause of the world. So you find a mundane example to say, well, it can be done in even a mundane thing like milk turning to curds. So what to speak of Brahman? So there we are. That's a little argument there. And we move on to the next thing. Now, if Brahman, sorry, here's the sutra, 26. Brahman's being the cause of the world involves either the possibility of the entire Brahman being modified, or the violation of the scriptural statement that Brahman is without parts. Okay, so the opponent says, look, you want to say that Brahman is the cause of the world. Does the whole of Brahman become the world and there's no God left over? God is exhausted in the transformation of Brahman. God is exhausted by transforming itself into the world. There's no God left over then. The God is the world then. That's kind of like a type of deism. So either that, or you say, no, only a part of God transforms into the world, and then a part remains God. So in which case, Brahman has parts then. So that's going to be the argument. And that goes against the idea that God has parts, violates the scriptural statement that Brahman is without parts. So the opponent wants to trap Vedanta into a quandary, into a corner. Either you say the whole of Brahman transforms into the world, but then you've got no Brahman left, then you just got the world. Why not just say the world is God? Well, that's what the materialists would say. We don't need to talk about God anymore. Then God's exhausted by the transformation into the world. So either the whole of Brahman transforms into the world or a part. Well, if it's a part, then that means one part transforms into the world, one part doesn't, remains God, the Godhead. But then you've got two parts then, or three parts if you add the souls. So then you have a Brahman with parts, and that goes against the scripture, says the opponent. Let's see. If Brahman is without parts, and yet the material cause of the world, if there's no parts, then we have to admit the entire Brahman evolves into the multiform universe. And it must completely, if there's no parts, then all of Brahman transforms. So there will be no Brahman left, nothing left over, transformed into the world, and consequently no ruler of the world either. There's no superintending God. If, on the other hand, it is said that the whole of Brahman does not undergo modification, but only a part. One part of Brahman is the world, one part is the soul, and one part remains God. And therefore, a portion gets evolved as the sentient world of souls, and a portion as the world of matter. So one portion is soul, one portion is God, and then there's a third, which is God himself, who doesn't get transformed. And that's, so if you want to say that, says the opponent, then we have to accept that Brahman is made up of parts in its causal state. But that's denied. The opponent says that you'll end up having to say that, but you can't say that because you're Vedantins and you accept the scriptures, and the scriptural texts say there's no parts. Look, and he quotes, in the beginning, my boy, being alone was all this, one without a second, no parts. And that's from the Chandogya. CHA is Chandogya, 621. In the beginning, verily, all this was Atman alone, nothing else. Aitariya, 111. So in either case, it leads to a dilemma. Either the whole of Brahman's transformed, then you've got no God, or parts transform, and then you have a God with parts, and then you've gone against the scripture. That's your dilemma. So Brahman cannot be the cause of the world, is the conclusion of the opponent. So Ramanuja says, but it cannot be like that. On account of scriptural texts supporting both the apparently contradictory views, and on account of Brahman's possessing various powers being based on the scripture only. So then the sutra says, no, well, the scriptures say different things at different places, and Brahman has powers, he can do anything he wants. That's what it means to be omnipotent. Let's see how Ramanuja phrases it. But, that's the two here. But, shretes tu, there's the two in the Sanskrit. But refutes the view of the former sutra. There is no dilemma whatsoever for scripture. Why? Because scriptures they do declare that Brahman was without parts, but they also declare that Brahman is the material cause of the world of multiforms, trees, mountains, lots of forms, multiforms. It may be said that even scriptures, oops, what did I just do? I went to the wrong page. It may be said that even scriptures cannot say what is absurd. Let's skip that bit. Oh, we did it again. I'm hitting the wrong button. Right, let's just go up here. So, and now he says, okay, let's just read that bit again. But it may be said that even scriptures cannot say what is absurd. Even a scripture may be sacred text, but it doesn't say talk nonsense. It can't say one thing and then say another thing. It can't say, for example, water with fire, because that's absurd. Water doesn't have fire. So Ramanuja is saying, no, scripture doesn't say absurd things, but it seems to say both things. It seems to say that there are no parts, and yet it is also creates the world and is not exhausted by that. So how does he conclude this? But in matters of supersensuous, right, beyond our sense perception, we can't see God, we can't see the creation of the world. Scriptures alone are authority, and ordinary standards of reasoning do not apply there. So rather than answering philosophically, Ramanuja says, well, it seems like a dilemma, but that's what the scriptures say, that on the one hand, there's no parts. On the other hand, the world is created, the souls are created, and God is not exhausted by that. So we just have to accept that. Maybe it's a mystery, perhaps as the Christians would say, or it's something that's beyond reason. That's what he's saying. It's supersensuous. Whatever, right? And it goes beyond ordinary standards of reasoning. Whatever thing is established by the proper means of knowledge, with respect to it, must be taken to be of a nature as declared by the particular source of knowledge. So the scriptures are a source of knowledge. And once you've established the scriptures are a perfect source of knowledge, which they've argued previously, right in the very beginning of the text, then you just have to accept the scripture, even in matters which may seem puzzling to the rational mind. So, okay, so Brahman is unique and beyond our ordinary comprehensions. Now he's relying on the fact that we can't understand God with our limited intelligences. That's where it's going. It is quite unlike everything we experience in the world, and it possesses infinite powers. You cannot apply, okay? It can do anything. It's omnipotent, omniscience, as any theist would say. And so you can't apply here the reasoning, which holds good in our ordinary experience, and with respect to things of finite power, right? We have our ordinary experiences, and with limited power, and whatever we deduce from that, we can't apply that to God. God is a different category. It's beyond comprehension. You can't apply our mundane reasoning. The rule of, okay, let's go down a little bit. So also the principle that causal things, which produce effects, have parts, is not applicable in the case of Brahman. In our normal perception, our normal experience, if there's a cause and it produces effects, then we've got parts. There's the part that was the cause, the part that was the effect. So there's two different parts. So if milk produces yogurt, well, milk, they're not the same thing. They're two different parts of an entity that's transformed. That reasoning is not applicable to Brahman. But the texts declare it to be without parts. He says, yeah, they do declare it to be without parts. And yet, at the same time, the material cause of the world. So we have to accept this view expressed by texts. And there is no room for any doubt as to how Brahman without parts became many. We just have to accept it. So that's really a dogmatic answer, a theological answer. It's dogmatic, meaning you just have to accept it. You can't reason your way to it. So at this point, he's stepping at, he's a good philosopher, Ramanuja. At certain points, I think any theist has to accept, unless you want to say you can capture God by your puny intellect, that becomes problematic too. If we could understand everything about God with our intellect, that would mean God would be limited by the limitations of our intelligence. That our intelligence would somehow be capable of understanding the infinite unlimited one. Our intellects are limited, so therefore there must be a whole lot of God that lies beyond the power of human comprehension. Any theist would accept that in any tradition. So at certain points, the theist would just say, "This is how it is. The scriptures tell us it is so. We just have to accept it." It's dogmatic, but it doesn't mean that. It just means that philosophy. I mean, these are amazing philosophers. Ramanuja is an extraordinary philosopher. But at some point, everybody has to say, even a scientist has to say, well, Big Bang, we don't know what was before it. We can't go there. Any philosophy has to have a stop sign saying, okay, well, this is our foundational truth. We just accept this as a foundational truth, whether it's theism, materialism, any kind of ism, There has to be some basis, and then you say, well, we can't go any further than that. We can't go beyond that. That's a stop sign, right? So Big Bang is a stop sign. You can't start asking questions before Big Bang. So any intellectual system looking for ultimate causation, what's the ultimate cause of reality, is going to run into, is going to put up a stop sign at some point, say this is as far as we can go within this system. So Ramanuja is saying that. That doesn't make him anti-philosophical. He's wrote a whole book on philosophy. The entire Vedanta Sutra is arguing his way philosophically, but ever so often, philosophy itself arrives at the conclusion that if there is an unlimited God, then it cannot be totally fitted into the limitations of human reasoning and philosophy. Philosophy itself can arrive at that conclusion. That's a philosophical conclusion. That if there's a God and God is unlimited, then by definition, then God lies beyond those limitations and therefore cannot be fully understood. Okay, so I hope that's clear. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. We'll go on to, I think, the next page. That was 27. And we will move on to, let's go up there. We did that. 27. Go back to where we were. And then the other thing you can do is what he does in 29. And on account of the opponent's own view being subject to these very objections, you're still not answering it philosophically. You're saying, but anyway, your philosophy, you opponents, you Sāṃkhya people, you've got the same problem. If you say that's a problem for us, it's a problem for your philosophy as well. So the opponent's own view being subject to the same objections. If, as the Sāṃkhyas say, the pradhana is the cause, right, prakriti, then it being, according to them, non-different in nature from ordinary things, the defects seen in those things would also attach to the pradhana. So we cannot come, so it's a slightly different argument, actually. He's saying, well, if you say the pradhana is the cause of everything, then the world is full of defects. So that means your pradhana is full of defects too. It's not quite the same argument and that we were just pursuing with the parts, but it doesn't matter. Let's go along. Oh no, here he gets to it here. Here we are. Right? Moreover, as pradhana also is without parts, he's saying, well, you say your pradhana is without parts. Although I'm not sure Sāṃkhya would quite say that, because they do say there's 3 gunas. So it's not clear to me anyway that Sāṃkhya would actually say it's without parts, because they do, they would have to somehow accommodate the 3 gunas. As pradhana is without parts, and yet produces the effects, the mahat meaning, all the effects that come out of Sāṃkhya, the mind, the intelligence, the qualities, color, shape, form, the substances, earth, water, fire, air, ether, all the effects, everything in the world. Remember that the mind is also made of the 3 gunas, psychic matter, gross matter. Sāṃkhya says it all comes from pradhana, but he claims that at the same time they say pradhana is without parts, so then you have the same problem, Sāṃkhya, then. You're saying something without parts produces a world full of parts. So why you come after us? You need to fix that problem in your own philosophy. So that's another way of dealing with an argument. You don't actually respond to it philosophically, but you throw it back at the opponent. Say, well, if you think we got that problem, so have you. It is not possible for pradhana without parts to produce effects which do have parts, inasmuch, right, a table is not a chair, green is not red, so there are differences in creation. As it is of a similar nature with other things which we ordinarily experience. He's saying it's even harder for you because you say your pradhana is the same as the world. At least we say our God is in some way different. But Brahman, on the other hand, is quite different from other things. Maybe he produces the world out of the powers, the Shaktis of God, but God is also distinct. So he's saying, not only do you have that problem, you Sāṃkhya people, you have it even worse than we do. Because you're saying your prakriti is material. It's actually of the very same nature as its effects. Because it's the 3 gunas. Prakriti is the 3 gunas, and all effects are the 3 gunas. This is what it is because it's made of 3 gunas. This is what it is because it's made of 3 gunas. So your cause and effect are the same, but the effect is full of parts. So how can your cause be without parts then? Don't come after us. You've got the same problem, and you've got it even worse than we do. at least with us. But Brahman, on the other hand, is quite different from other things. And so the rule that without parts, a cause cannot produce effects is not applicable in our case, because it's different from the effects. So the effects can have parts, but Brahman need not. The only source, and then he goes back to the scripture. The only source about Brahman is scripture. Human reasoning can only take you so far. And scripture clearly declares that Brahman, though without parts, is yet nonetheless the material cause of the world as it possesses infinite power. So with the argument finished, that's what the scripture says. Can't argue any further than that. And that's it. And then here he says, we won't read the whole thing. And Brahman is endowed with all powers because it is seen from the scriptures. Tad darshanat sarva upādāna cha tad darshanat. And Brahman is endowed with all powers because it's seen from the scriptures. Brahman, and then he quotes the scriptures. So that Ramanuja is going to provide the scriptures that the sutra refers to, doesn't provide. Ramanuja provides it. Brahman is endowed with all powers, and this fact is not to be understood merely from the text, it willed, may I be many, Chandogya, but from various other texts. And then he quotes a bunch of texts. Let's move on. I think we've exhausted that topic. Not particularly super interesting. Oh, well, let's go to this argument. Another objection up here, right, page 236, third line. An objection is raised. Oh, let's read the sutra then. We didn't read the sutra. Down the bottom. If it be said that because Brahman is devoid of organs, it is not able to create, though endowed with powers, we say this has already been explained. He already explained that you know, you don't need to have instruments, organs meaning instruments. You don't need to have instruments to create. And he gave the example of milk without instrumentation becoming yogurt. So how's he going to do this? And so he says, an objection is raised that though Brahman is endowed with all powers, right, could do anything by will, yet it is destitute of instruments, doesn't have any instruments, so it cannot produce an effect, can't create the world. This sutra refutes it by saying that this objection has already been answered already. So I don't know why they're bringing it up again, because they already answered it. It's a bit, anyway, so we started off this session with that argument. That Brahman, for which the scriptures alone are the source of knowledge. Now remember, that's Vedanta Sutra 1.5. We read Shankara was commenting on it earlier in the course. Shastrayonitvac, 1.14. First chapter, first section 4. Tato Brahma Jignasu, first sutra. Janmadhyasya yataha, that from which, you know, creation and maintenance and destruction emerge. That's the second. Tato Brahma Jignasu, Janmadhyasya yataha. Get the third. And Shastrayonitvac. Oh, actually, it's the third. Shastrayonitvac. And it was either the third or the fourth sutra. And it is known by scripture. Okay? Either that, let me tell you right now, so we don't leave that hanging. Is it the third or the fourth? I'm going to say the third. And yes, Shastrayonitvac. Okay, so the beginning of the text, we read Shankara's comment on it. So back here, Brahman, for which the scriptures alone are the source of knowledge, and which is different from other things. Brahman is capable through mere volition, by will alone. God wills the universe into existence, of producing these effects, even though without accessories. He doesn't need tools. He's not limited, but like we are, we have to have tools. God can just will. Any theist is going to say that. Right, and he says he sees without eyes, he hears without ears, without hands and feet, he hastens and grasps. So he doesn't need these instruments, but he knows everything. He's omniscient, but he doesn't need eyeballs like we do. In fact, our eyeballs are limitations of karma, that sort of limit our consciousness. So we can only see a certain range, see certain colors. God doesn't have those limits. The instruments that we use are actually limitations on consciousness. But that's a story for yoga. We'll maybe revisit that when we get to yoga. Now we move into a different topic, and I welcome it. So the next topic is Brahman's creation is no motive behind, except a sporting impulse. So the next issue is, well, why would, forget all of that, parts and all of that, fair enough. But why would God create in the first place? What's his motive? He's supposed to be self-satisfied and self-content. Why would he want to create a world of suffering? Interesting topic, my friends. I think you'll find this a little bit more interesting if you didn't find the last discussion interesting. Stay with this one, you might find it. Don't we all ask, why is there suffering? Why does God allow suffering? Well, let's see what the text says. In the previous topic, it has been shown that as Brahman is endowed with all powers, it is capable of creating the world through mere volition. A fresh objection is now raised. That's topic 11 up here. What's the new objection? It cannot be the cause of the world, as it has no need to create a world, being self-sufficient. If I'm self-sufficient, I don't need it to do anything. I'm completely self-contained. I'm reveling in my own bliss, my own internal bliss. I don't need to create or run around or do anything. And if God is perfect and self-fulfilled and self-contained, why does God need to create that? So therefore Brahman can't be the cause of the world, because there'd be no motive. So Brahman is not the creator of the world, says the opponent, because creative powers appear to have a motive behind it. If I create something, there's a motive. I want something, right? So I'm going to, I don't know, create a meal. So my motive is to eat. So I get my ingredients and I create a meal. Or I build a house. There's a motive behind it. Ramanuja. There is some motive or purpose at the back of this creation. If you create, it's an action. So there must be a motive. And the Lord has no purpose to gain by such creation. So that the opponent wants to say, so there's no Lord. If there were a Lord, there'd be a motive for creation. And what could the motive possibly be for a self-fulfilled and internally blissful God? Nobody engages himself in any action without a motive or purpose, says the opponent. This purpose can be twofold. There's two kinds of motives for action. It can either to satisfy one's own desires, or for the sake of others. I might cook a meal for my daughter, or I might cook for myself. Action is triggered either for self-interest or serving somebody else. But Brahman, being self-sufficient, has nothing to gain for itself by the creation of the world. So the first option, you do it for yourself. Well, Brahman has no self-interest or personal motive to create the world. So that can't be that out of those two options of creating for yourself or creating for someone else, out of those two, Brahman can't be creating for his own purpose, because he's content. Neither can it be for the sake of the individual souls. It can't be for others either. Why not? For in that case, it would have created a world full of happiness. If you were creating a world for others, if I'm cooking a meal for my daughter, I'm not going to throw sand in it or fill it up with salt so it's unedible. I'm going to make it as best as I can to make her happy. So if it created it for the individual souls, it would have created a world full of happiness out of pity for the souls, and not the world full of suffering for them. Don't we all wonder why, if there is a God, this is why people become atheists. They say, how can there be a God? Not because of philosophical argumentation, it's more of an emotional argument. How can there be a God given all the suffering? Surely a benevolent God would not allow suffering. And an omnipotent God would be able to stop it. This is called the theodicy problem in Western theistic traditions. And the great Christian theologians have had to really grapple with this in all different sorts of ways. How can how can we talk of a loving, compassionate, merciful God when all the suffering in the world? So then, if God was benevolent, this is the same argument here, it would have created a world full of happiness out of pity for the souls, and not the world full of suffering. Therefore, as Brahman has no purpose for itself, and it can't have done it for others, because then it wouldn't have done it full of suffering, as it has no purpose whatsoever, neither self nor other, the two types of purposes, it has neither of those, no purpose whatsoever to achieve by this creation, then it can't be the cause of the world then. So what's the answer to that very rather difficult question? No one can answer the question, my friends. No philosophical tradition that believes in God. No one has a very good answer for that. I mean, we could say it's karma. Okay, well, the world is full of suffering because of karma that we did maybe in a past life. but then say, well, what about why was there suffering in that past life? Oh, it was a life before that. Oh, why was there suffering in the life before that? And you can keep going back, and then you'd end up, they would say, well, it's anadi, it's beginningless. There's no beginning to it. Well, that's not particularly satisfying, is it? So no one has, and if you're, say Christian and you only believe in one life, in some ways you have an even greater problem, because you can't even say, well, there's some sort of cause. You did something in a past life and that's why you're suffering now. You can't say that if you only have one life. You have to explain, well, why does God put one soul in a miserable condition and another soul in a happy, pious, righteous sort of family? They don't have the same chance to be moral and to be good. So you have an even more of a problem why God creates these inequalities in the one life model. So, but either model, it's going to end up running at some point in just saying that's the way it is. Either you don't question the mind of God, or you just say, well, there's an infinity of past rebirths and there's no beginning to them. Neither is going to satisfy a mind that seeks cause and effect. That's a rational mind. A rational mind operates by cause and effect. There's an effect. What's the cause? Right? This is a cause. What sort of effect will it produce? That's philosophy. That's science. What's science? You look at effects and you try to, posit the causes. Philosophy. So that's what reason is. Reason is a kind of an enterprise to a great extent. Philosophy, science, intellectuality, to a great extent, is an enterprise conditioned by trying to postulate or analyze and speculate about what is the best causal explanation for a phenomenon. There's a phenomenon, we don't understand it. What's the best explanation? And then different people offer their explanations, and in science, and some get the approval of the majority of scientists, like black matter is an explanation for certain effects that are viewed. And then, then someone postulates, well, maybe the universe is filled up with 90% dark matter. We can't see it. And at first there's a bit of a debate, and eventually gets accepted as the best causal explanation, and maybe it'll get subverted in time. Okay, but that's how the rational mind works, cause and effect. Okay, so so let's move on. So 33, all of which is to say, where I was going with that is no one can explain the why it's suffering. Karma goes quite a long way to explaining it, because that's cause and effect. I act and the effect comes to me, and that's why I suffer. And it may not come in this life. So that is karma is a cause and effect argument. So in that sense, it's a rational argument, and it kind of satisfies, right? If something happens to me, I don't want to feel it's random. Just molecules, subatomic particles and forces bumping into each other, and randomly suffering comes to me. Nor do I want to think it's just some whimsical God. I prefer to think, okay, this is, I don't like this suffering, but okay, maybe I did something in a past life or this life. I know I do bad things and wrong things, and it makes sense. I like to see other people also held accountable for their actions. I like to see justice. So then I'm also have to accept that in my own case. So karma goes a long way. Karma doesn't explain. It just says it's beginningless. It's not going to start with a first causal moment. Then you have to explain why in that first causal moment our souls put in different situations, and there's no explanation for that. So therefore, you just say there's no first causal moment. At least that's the solution Indian philosophers took, rather than try to say there was a first, like for example, Christians say there's creation ex nihilo, God creates out of nothing. Then you have to explain, well, why are you creating souls differently and putting them in different situations in the world where they don't have the same chance to be good and righteous? Maybe someone's born in a family of mafioso and told to kill someone at a young age, and someone else is born in a family of great saintly people. That's not fair then. So anyway, no one, all of which is to say, suffering is a mystery. Karma, in my opinion, goes a long distance, a good long way in explaining our immediate karma. It has nothing to say and cannot say anything about the very, very first original primordial beginning of it all. And rather than say that, Indian thinkers have said that there was no beginning. That's how they just not avoid the whole issue, but they just sidestep it and say we can't go further than that. That's as far as we can go. All right, let's read on. Well, we got plenty of time. It's the clock. We've only got 35 minutes. We may not use the whole hour and 20 minutes, my friends. I'm not going to jump to another text. Let's allow, let's linger. Let me slow down a bit. Maybe I'm talking too fast. So, what about this? The why of creation. If Brahman is self-fulfilled, self-contained, self-content, why create? People act either for themselves or for others. Brahman's not going to act from itself because it doesn't need anything. It's perfect and fulfilled. And it can't be acting for others because that's not very nice to create a world of suffering for others. So why would it do that? So therefore, neither of those explanations work. Therefore, Brahman can't be the cause of the world. That's where the opponent wants to end up. Vedanta has to resist. And so Ramanuja says, but even kings engage themselves in activity like playing with a ball without any motive but for mere amusement, or even as children play out of fun, right? So he's saying, first of all, he's questioning that the premise that action always requires a motive. He's saying, no, we don't accept that, right? The opponent says either the motive is for yourself or for others, and Vedanta first, and Ramanuja, first of all, pushes back on that and says, oh, hang on a minute, why should we accept that? People can act without any motive, like a king, just out of pure enjoyment. Here you have the word lila. Lokavat too, but like in the world, lila. Lila kevalyam. Lila kevalyam. Kevalyam, just for lila, just for play, just for sport. The term lila becomes important in Krishna devotion. And we're going to read a story at the end of the course, my friends. We're going to read one of Krishna's Leela. Krishna just having fun. But Brahman, Krishna is Brahman. Brahman entering into the world in the beautiful form of Sri Krishna, especially as a young child in the forests of Vrindavan, it's now a holy place in North India. Just to exchange love with his devotees as bhaktas. Okay, keep this in mind. We'll get back to this. We'll end the course on a beautiful Krishna Leela. So he's saying, here it is, the word Leela in the Vedanta. Ishvara creates just out of Leela, just out of amusement. So just like a king plays with a ball without any motive for mere amusement, or even his children play out of fun, so also Brahman, without any purpose to gain, engages itself in creating this world of diversity as a mere pastime. He just does it out of fun, not that he needs to. It's just part of the infinite variegatedness of God, and that variegatedness is dynamic and full of all possibilities, and one expression of that is the creation of the world. Then what about, but then the arguments, part of the argument still holds. Well, why would he create a world? It might be fun for him. It's not fun for us down here when we have to get old and die and suffer. How is that fun? Well, that sounds like a sadistic God then, doesn't it? It sounds like a very cruel God that just out of fun creates the world, and the world is full of suffering, and we've seen the suffering. Look at just put on the news. So now we're going to get the second part of that, of the opponent's objection. An objection is raised, well, it already was raised, but he's bringing it to the forefront again. An objection is raised against the view expressed in this sutra. The creation of a world in which there is so much suffering. Hey, this is the first noble truth of Buddhism. Well, everything is suffering. The four noble truths of the great Lord Buddha. Sarvam dukkha. It's the central verse of the Yoga Sutras. The suffering in the world is not nice. We see it on TV, and occasionally it afflicts us. Is that all just God having? Is it just God's amusement? Like we might watch a horror movie and we get amusement out of it. Not that I would, but some people like. I think when I was a kid, I probably got off on horror movies. So we like to see. In fact, when you're a kid, at least when I was a kid, maybe they've changed the cartoons now. But when I was a kid, the cartoons were quite mean. Like Tom and Jerry, the cat, was it Tom? He was always getting electrocuted and smashed with huge boulders falling on his head, and we would laugh. That's kind of mean. Maybe they've tidied up the cartoons. I don't know what they're like now. I'm talking about my pre-politically correct days. So there is a kind of fun, I suppose, that comes from meanness of watching the suffering of others, right? So is that what God's like then? Is he just sort of someone that enjoys watching others suffer? So let's go back to the Ramanuja. The creation of a world in which there is so much suffering would subject Brahman to the charge of partiality and cruelty. How so? Well, partiality, not everyone's suffering the same. We may be suffering, but not like people in Syria are suffering right now, or in Ethiopia, or in some parts of the world, Afghanistan. That's partiality, that why some are suffering and others are not. So that's one problem. And then cruelty. Are you enjoying the suffering? And as we just discussed. So Brahman is full of pity. If you want to say Brahman is kind and loving and full of pity and benevolent, that sort of a Brahman cannot be the cause of this diabolical world, this awful world. I mean, look in the grass, big insects ripping off the limbs of other insects. Birds coming down and grabbing some poor little, bug and just crushing it in its beaks. It's a pretty violent. Reality is violent if you look carefully. So Brahman is full of pity. Cannot be the cause of this diabolical world, even out of mere sport, even out of just fun. How are you going to get out of that one now? It's a tough one. So partiality and cruelty cannot be attributed to Brahman. Now the response. Okay, that was the objector, the previous sutra. Sometimes the sutra is an objection, the objector, and then the next sutra is the response. Or sometimes you might have 2 or 3 sutras, or all kind of sort of continuing an objection, or objecting, and then there's a response, and then there's a new objection. Okay, well, accepting that. Well, what about this? So that's how it works, right? So an entire sutra could be an objection. In this case, now we have the response: partiality and cruelty, right? The 2 charges that the opponent brings. Some are suffering more than others, that's partiality, but everyone's suffering, that's cruelty. So partiality and cruelty cannot be attributed to Brahman. Why not? On account of its taking into consideration other reasons in the matter. Well, there's other causes of suffering. Okay, let's see how Ramanuja explains what they are. And then, of course, we're familiar with the Vedanta refrain, because the scripture declares it to be so. So that now we're back into a dogmatic. Dogmatic means not argued for by reason and argument and philosophy, just asserted. It is so because the scriptures say so. That's dogma. It may be true. I'm not saying it's true or false. When you say something's dogmatic, you're not talking about its its truth value, veridicality, as philosophers like to say. You're not talking about whether it's true or not. You're just saying that it's asserted. Something could be asserted and it could be true. Like I could say, look, the sky is blue. I'm asserting it. I'm not arguing for it. But in these sorts of when you're talking about religious assertions, you could also call them dogmas. It's not a bad word necessarily, but it means they're not a philosophical word. Philosophers are not supposed to be dogmatic, although obviously they can be, and they probably all philosophers are at some point. At some point, either you accept something, some foundational truth, or you don't accept anything. But let's get back to this. Now, some are born as men, while others are born as gods. Remember the celestials, small g, not talking about Ishvara here. There's just more powerful beings with better karma, the devas. So the Lord is partial to some. He's cruel in as much as he... Okay, no, this is still the opponent. Now let's read on. Oh yeah, here's the opponent. He is cruel inasmuch as he creates a world full of suffering for the souls. Opponent still. Now Ramanuja, the latter part of the sutra refutes these objections. 2 objections: partiality, cruelty, and says that on account of the Lord's taking into consideration the past karma of the various beings before creating them as gods, man, or lower animals, partiality cannot be attributed to him. So this is the argument, that you're born as a god or as a man or as an animal or as a woman, and you're born in this family or that family. Maybe you're born in a war zone. Your parents are killed when you're young, or maybe bomb drops on your house and you get, and you're only 2 years old. I mean, there's horrible things that happen. So karma says, well, that's because you did that to somebody else in a past life. So it's easier to explain suffering in a multi-life model than it is if you only accept one life. Because then you can't say, well, I did something in a past life. If you don't accept past lives, then how do you explain that? The awful inequality. So this partiality argument, one life model theories have a harder time. And multi-life models, at least they can say, if we accept it, of course we have to argue for multi-life and not just dogmatically asserted. There are arguments that are given that we not part of this course, but a cause and effect arguments that everything is cause and effect. That's how inferences work, right? Wherever there's smoke, there's always fire. So wherever everything we see is explained by a cause, a causal relationship. All effects have a cause. All causes have effects. All actions create effects. So why should human behavior be any different? Why should human action be exempt from the law? It's an action, so it must produce an effect. What kind of an effect? Well, it's an immediate effect, right? I move something, so it moves. But there's also the sort of psychic intent. There's a psychic level to action. Now, not just the physical effect that we perceive, but there's the psychic intention behind it. And that psychic intention produces an effect that comes. Whatever the intention of that action is, the equal and opposite result of that will come back. That's a rational argument. You may not accept it. You may find ways of resisting it, but at least it's a rational argument. It's not a dogmatic argument. So, so he starts off by saying there's no partiality. People are born in different situations because of what they themselves did. Don't blame God. They themselves did in a past life. Souls are born according to their past karma in different species. Some species are, I'm sure that there's lots of species you would rather not be born into. Imagine being born, I don't know, a small fish in the ocean, and a big, you can't, everywhere you swim, the predator's trying to eat you. Can't be a very happy existence. Or a small bug, when there's birds and trying to eat you and big bugs trying to rip you apart. Can't be a very happy existence. Souls are born according to their past karma in different species. So their karma accounts for the difference in their condition, and not the Lord's partiality. It's what you do comes back to you. That's the law of karma. Whatever you've done comes back to you. Shruti also declares the same thing. And remember, you make an argument. This is a kind of a rational argument, but if you're a Vedantin, you do make rational arguments. You make philosophical arguments, but they always have to be backed up by scripture. So after you've made your philosophical argument, then you wheel out your scriptural quotes and say, Shruti also declares the same thing that we've just established by philosophy and reason, we're now going to establish by scripture. Man becomes good by good work, bad by bad work. Brihadaranyaka. So the Lord is only the operative cause in the creation of beings, right? Lord connects the appropriate effects to the causes. You're free to act. He doesn't make you act. But once you act, you generate an effect. And the Lord oversees the connection of the right effects with the right causes. So he's just the overseer. The operating agent is what it's called here. The operative cause. The main cause is the past karma of the beings. Karma is the law. And then God oversees the law, like the judge. Just as the rain helps different seeds to sprout, each according to its nature, so the Lord is the general efficient cause in bringing the latent tendencies of each individual to fruition. He brings the tendencies that are already in our own minds and psyches, he brings them to fruition, and he connects the effects. So he's neither partial nor cruel. Okay, so then we're on 35. Yeah. Right, let's keep on. If it be said that it's not possible for want of any distinction in work before creation, we say no, because the world is beginningless. This is reasonable and also seen from the scriptures. Okay, so it has to be reasonable, has to sort of satisfy logic and philosophical inquiry, but it also has to be supported by scripture. And if it's not reasonable, then but it is supported by scripture, or if it's trans-rational, it goes beyond reasoning, then scripture is our only source of reliable information. Remember that. I know I'm repeating it, I'm saying it in different ways, just to make sure that that's clear for you all. Right, what's the argument? Before creation, it was Brahman alone, and nothing else existed. Right, the text say that. We read it. There's one alone. And it said, and it willed, let me become many. But in the beginning, it was one alone. There were no individual souls. And so there was no karma to justify the inequality in creation. In other words, he's saying, fine, something bad happens to me. You can't say God is partial or cruel, because something bad happens to me. I did it in the previous life, and now I'm getting the results, so it's fair. But then the opponent says, okay, fine, that may be the case in this life, but what about the very, very beginning of creation? There was no previous life. What about the very first moment of creation, a Big Bang moment? The souls are all injected into Prakriti in different situations. So it's like the Christians would have to argue like this. It is creatio ex nihilo. And the opponent is saying, well, there must have been some beginning, right? And at that beginning moment, that you can't blame the inequalities of the souls on a previous life, because that was the first life, the first act of creation. That's what the opponent's saying. The opponent's saying, before creation, there was Brahman alone, and nothing else existed. So there were no individual souls. So there was no karma to justify the inequality in creation. Once creation starts, all the souls are injected in different situations. But why? It's the first light. It's the first moment of creation. So there's no karma. Karma hasn't kicked in yet. That there were no souls before creation is declared by the scriptures. And he quotes the scriptures. The opponent. This is all the opponent. In the beginning, dear boy, there was this being alone, one only, Chandogya. That's the opponent. Now the Ramanuja, his reading of the sutra. Remember, that's his reading. Shankara may, he often agrees with Shankara, but often disagrees. This sutra refutes this and says, no, for the souls in their karma form an eternal stream which is beginningless. Individual souls are not created, but existed before creation. Remember that creation is cyclical in Hinduism. There is creation, and then it's dissolution, and then there's a period of latency, but then there's a new creation. And so that the cycle of creativity is eternal. So in one particular Big Bang moment, it appears that all the souls are thrust into a new universe, and they are, but they're picking up from a previous Big Bang, from the previous cycle of creativity. So the whole entire cycle is beginningless. Within that cycle, there are creations, dissolutions, period of latency, creation, dissolution, period of latency, Big Bang, evolution, devolution. Everything goes back to Prakriti, period of latency. But that whole, and the souls are eternal too. So they're just injected from one cycle into the next. The ones that don't get liberated, then in the period of latency, they're covered by tamas until the cycle kicks off again. So the sutra refuses and says, no, for the souls in their karma form an eternal stream which is beginningless. Individual souls are not created, right? They do not accept the Christian notion of creation out of nothing. They got created out of nothing. Souls are eternal. If you can create something, you can destroy it. So individual souls, but they existed even before creation in a very subtle condition, almost non-distinguishable from Brahman. They're subtle, they're in a period of, they're basically covered by Brahman's powers, tamas, the shaktis, almost indistinct. They are distinct from Brahman, but almost indistinguishable. And hence the scriptures declare the non-existence of everything but Brahman before creation. So Ramanuja is saying, sure, the scriptures say there was only Brahman and nothing else existed, but actually the souls existed, but they were almost indistinguishable because they were in this latent, like a hibernation state. So he's basically saying the scriptures are talking a bit loosely, a bit metaphorically. They say nothing existed. What they really mean is, sure, the souls existed in the subtle hibernative state, almost indistinguishable. So the scriptures just said there's only Brahman in the beginning. So that's what he's saying. The scriptures are slightly not being 100% precise. They're being just rhetorically making that statement. What the text denies is the existence of being in the gross state with name and form. And the scriptures say there's nothing between creation, before creation. They're talking about name, forms like trees and mountains and universes, and we give names to them. The gross reality hasn't manifested, but subtle reality in a kind of latent state does exist. So that's his way of responding to this. But the souls did exist in a subtle condition, even before creation. Right? This is reasonable also, for otherwise souls will be punished for acts they did not commit. If you just create a soul and put it into the universe, and it's just, and that's the beginning, and all the souls are in different situations, well, some are being punished. They're born in awful situations, in a war zone, or whatever. And so why are they being punished for something they didn't commit if you don't allow a previous life? So you're saying that's not reasonable to think like that. For otherwise, souls will be punished for acts they did not commit. And all right, Hinduism says they did commit an act in the previous cycle of creativity. Okay, I made the point. They would go without punishment for wrong acts committed by them. And then he goes on to quote about how the souls are eternal. Right, just bringing out the usual Upanishad quotes. Go to the end. Moreover, creation also is beginningless. Okay, I've just explained that. Cyclical creativity. And when the scriptures talk of the beginning of creation, they mean only the beginning of a new cycle, the new universe. Universe create, I think it lasts 14 billion years, but I may be getting, it's just an old memory that I have. And after 14 billion years, or maybe we're 14 billion years into this creation. I'm not quite sure if that's the case. I'm not quite sure when it ends, but billions and billions of years. And then everything just, if you're thinking about it in terms of Big Bang, everything expands out and then everything expands back in. But in this case, it expands back into Vishnu, God, not into some infinitesimally dense moment. Maybe it's infinitesimally dense in its gross form, but ultimately it's Shakti, a power of God. So, and then there's a period of equal, however long the universe lasts. We're 14 billion years into it, but I'm not sure how much longer it lasts. Whatever that period is, billions and billions. Then it dissolves. Then the same billions and billions of years, nothing happens. Everything is just dormant and latent in Brahman, and then the whole cycle picks up again. So these are the creative cycles, and they're infinite. They go on. Creation, dissolution, latency, creation, dissolution, latency. So that's what he's saying here. When the scriptures talk of the beginning of a creation, they only mean the beginning of this creation, a new cycle. And then he says, and how he's going to demonstrate that? This is borne out by texts like that. He quotes Rig Veda, very ancient, and not a great quote, but it's a quote. The Lord devised the sun and the moon as before. So the as before, Ramanuja takes that to mean as before in a previous creation. Bit of a weak quote, but he does what he wants to do. Okay, so we have 20 minutes, and for the first time ever, I normally I can't fit in what I want to fit in, but this time it would be great to have questions from you all, but of course this is asynchronous, so we can't do that. But let's read our last verse. Because all attributes required for the creation of the world are possible only in Brahman, it is the cause of the world. Only Brahman has the necessary attributes. Okay, let's see what he has to say here. As all the attributes necessary for the creation of the world, which were denied in the pradhana and atoms. Remember, the pradhana has no intelligence, so how can it create? And the atoms of the other school, the Vaiseshika, which we haven't discussed much, don't worry, they're sometimes called the atomists. They don't accept those three gunas. They think the ultimate, if you reduce everything down, if you dissolve the universe, reduce it into its irreducible components, what do you end up with? Atoms and forces, essentially. So, but both of them have the same fault from the point of view of Vedanta, is that the atoms are not intelligent, so they're not going to arrange themselves into the world. They have no intelligence. And likewise with the three gunas, they have no intelligence. So how are they going to sort of intermingle and produce the world of marvelous complexity? This is kind of a fine-tuning argument, or a type of intelligent design argument. As all attributes necessary for the creation of the world, which were denied pradhana and atoms, right, earlier on, they are possible in Brahman. Why? Because Brahman is intelligent. It's right, 5th sutra of the Vedanta Sutra, the first chapter. Ikshater, it thinks, it's intelligence, right? The gunas don't think, they're dead, inert matter. Atoms don't think, they're dead, inert particles. When I say atoms, I mean subatomic particles. We call them atoms now because that's what they called them when they first translated Sanskrit texts in the 19th century. At that time, they thought, Newtonian physics thought atoms were irreducible, but now we know, of course, we know that they're I know I've discussed this before, I'm just mentioning it again. We know that their atoms are reducible as particles, as electrons, neutrons, and even within those, there are a whole, who knows how far science will take us into the innermost nature of particles, and within them there's other particles, within those particles, who knows how far that would go. So the word in Sanskrit is particle, not atoms. But you see, but that word is stuck now, and so we see it in the translations, atoms, because that's just what it's called. But they're really a school which holds that reality ultimately consists of subatomic particles. So all the attributes are in Brahman. It is alone the cause of the world, as the powers of the pradhana and atoms are limited. Right? They have no consciousness. They're just dead inert. Right? Pradhana is the 3 gunas. The atoms are these particles of this other school, Vaiseshika. They're limited, and they are of the same nature as things seen in the world. Right? This is made of atoms. So if you say atoms are the ultimate cause of everything, that atoms are the particles. Well, the particles in this piece of wood are the same. And the same if you say this is made of the 3 gunas, and you say the cause is pradhana with the 3 gunas, well, then the cause and the effect are the same. So they're limited. Why are they limited? There's no consciousness, right? So as the powers of the pradhana and atoms are limited, and as they are of the same nature as things seen in the world, the cause is the same as their effects, there are any number of objections against the possibility of their being the cause of the world, and any number. And remember, the main one that they presented is intelligence. Atoms can't self-arrange. Something has to push them together. So you have forces, but then what's pushing the forces? What are forces? Even in physics, we don't know what forces are. We don't know what gravity is. We know what it does. We can measure it by its effects. We don't know what it is. We just know, we call it a force or a power. Even modern physics, you study the philosophy of science, we don't know what a force is, we know what it does. And according to what it does, we call it gravity or nuclear force or electromagnetic force. What is it? It's something that does something to something else. That's all we know. But what is it? But causes is that we have no explanation. I mean, some forces we can say are caused by other forces, but you get to a certain point where you can't go further. You just say it just is. And it does stuff. It causes things to move, essentially. Forces cause other entities, particles to move. What is it? That's a metaphysical question. And Vedanta would say these are just powers of Brahman, powers of Ishvara. And so therefore he's saying what I just said. Physics can't tell you what a force is, only what it does. And now what does Ramanuja says? As scriptures alone are the source of knowledge. Ramanuja would, if he was in a modern physics department, he would, he wouldn't reject any of the physics, but he would say, well, fine, you could go so far, but really what are particles? What are the forces? We know what they do. We know how they move and how they attach themselves and interact with each other, but what are they? He would say only scripture can tell you what they are. And of course he would say that they're Brahman. They're powers and shaktis of Brahman. As scriptures alone are the source of knowledge, my friends, with respect to Brahman. Notice this is Vedanta. This is the sine qua non of Vedanta. This is the defining principle of Vedanta. They're great theologians, great philosophers, great thinkers. They don't run away from debate. They engage other points of view all the time. But the final conclusion is always going to be only scripture can really give us ultimate information, about deep level, the ultimate causal information. Atoms can give you superficially. You can tell how many, you could even probably count how many atoms of Ramanuja wouldn't deny. You could count, if you had the equipment, you probably, in principle, you could count how many subatomic particles there are there and what are the forces that keep it all together. But ultimately, the why of it and what these things are, ultimately, metaphysically, science is ever probing. Now they're talking about string theory. Let's say that gets accepted. But then how do you know the strings are not an effect of something deeper? You can never know that. That's not. Newton thought the atom was the ultimate causal entity. But no, it's an effect produced from smaller entities. Science will never know if it gets to some ground level, irreducible dimension of reality. So Ramanuja, the only scripture can tell you answer those kinds of questions, right? So here he says it. The scriptures alone are the source of knowledge with respect to Brahman. It being quite different in nature from all things experienced, different from the tables and chairs and the green grass that I see out there. Quite different. And the scriptures alone declare that it possesses infinite powers, can do anything, and that it has no other motive than sport in creation. Okay, now going back to that, the reason, the why of creation. These are just amusement in accordance with karma. You may decide that you like that answer or not, that's up to you. But here it is, no other motive than amusement in creation. And arranges the diversity of creation, all the diversity and variegatedness of creation in accordance with the karma of the souls. So therefore, it's not partial, it's not cruel. It oversees you are allowed free will, oversees the law of action and reaction, and it alone can be the cause of the world. So that's it for, no, not quite it. We're going to add another section of Ramanuja responding to the Buddhists and Jains. But now we're going to go into the non-theistic arguments, my friends. Okay, those who reject the idea of Brahmanas or Ishvara. Because when you want to talk of as Brahman more in the sense of a personal intelligent being, then you might use the word Ishvara. Ishvara and Brahman mean the same thing. But Brahman is a little bit vaguer. It just means the absolute truth. It doesn't tell you whether the absolute is personal or impersonal. Remember, Shankara Brahman is ultimately impersonal. Everything else is a mirage, a superimposition. It's just impersonal, without quality, without form. Brahman that's ultimate and causal. Actually, wouldn't even say it was causal, because ultimately there are no effects for Shankara. It's all a mirage. So he thinks of Brahman in impersonal ways, and the personalists think of Brahman as a personal being. Vishnu for the Vaishnavas, Shiva for the Shaivas, but Vedanta is mostly a Vaishnava enterprise. And so Brahman is a personal being. And then when you want to be clear that you're talking about Brahman as a personal being, you use the word Ishvara, especially when you're talking about Brahman in relation to creation. Not so much in Vedanta, because because the word Ishvara is there in the Upanishads, but not as much as Brahman. Brahman is everywhere. So Vedanta then sort of, being faithful to the Upanishads and seeing itself as explicating the Upanishads, then uses the term Brahman. But Ishvara is the same thing. Okay, so Ishvara, when we're talking about Brahman, it can go either way, impersonal for Shankara, personal Ramanuja, but Ishvara, both Shankara and Ramanuja accept as the personal creator God. But for Shankara, of course, it's ultimately illusion, but he still accepts Ishvara in conventional reality, in sort of illusory reality, in the mirage, the world of the mirage. He accepts Ishvara as the creator God. Okay, so now we're going to, and I'm saying all of that because we're going to have anti-Ishvara arguments. And just to be clear in your mind, the connection between Ishvara and Brahman, same thing. Just the word Ishvara emphasizes the personal nature of Brahman, whereas just the word Brahman could be personal or impersonal, either way. All right, so we're going to have 4 or 5, and we have a couple of guest lectures. So you won't have to listen to me. In the next 2 weeks, we have a specialist in Jainism is going to give you the lecture on Jainism. And we have a short lecture from our old Rutgers student who sat in this Hindu Phil course 20 years ago, and is now a professor of Indian philosophy at Bridgewater State University. Matthew Dusty, the author of the book, you know him well from the book, which we will then return to after the near Ishvara, the ones that say there's no Ishvara. 2 weeks on them, right? Jains, but 2 on Buddhism, one Mimamsa, school of ritualists. Remember in the beginning of the Vedanta Sutra, the Purva-Paksha was the Mimamsas. They want to say, you know, that the scriptures are about prescription, prescribing you action, ritual. And Vedanta had to engage them first before they started engaging Sāṃkhya. They had to engage the ritualists, because the ritualists are even a little bit more problematic because they accept the same text. Sāṃkhya doesn't really care much about sacred texts. It accepts them. They're still Vedika. They accept the Vedas, but they don't quote them. They're mostly using reason and argument. They barely quote any Upanishads. None at all, practically. At least the text that we have. Sāṃkhya-kārikas, Yoga Sutras don't quote a single verse. But Mimamsas, they're powerful. They really know the scriptures inside out, and they know the older part of the scriptures. Let me introduce them. We have a few minutes. And so, where's my clock? What happened to the clock? Oh, I see. You've got 9 minutes. So the Mimamsas, then, that's going to be my lecture, maybe tomorrow or the next day, are these Vedic, these scholars, and for them the goal of life is to perform the Vedic ritual. They're not happy with people going off into the forest to seek the Atman and seek Brahman, because then they give up their worldly duties. They stop performing the sacrifice. And the Vedic ritualists say, no, we have to perform the sacrifices the Vedas tell us. The older texts do. The Upanishads are the later part of the Vedic canon. And they're more, you know, they don't reject the Vedas, but they sort of say this is for more materially minded people who want the fruits of sacrifice. They do all these sacrifices to get things, but they're still attached to the world. But we're Vedantins, we seek a higher truth. We're attached to the Atman, which is a higher truth. So they see themselves as Vedanta, the higher portion of the Vedas. So, but the Mimamsas are atheists, because they don't even accept this creativity that we've been talking about, the universe, the cyclicality of the universe. Because then what happens to the Vedas in between? Do they go into a dissolution, dissolved state? And how do they manifest in the new creation? So the others say, well, Ishvara speaks them. Vedanta says Ishvara speaks the Vedas the beginning of the new creation, but that makes the Vedas dependent on Ishvara, and the Mimamsas don't like that. They don't even like that, even though Ishvara is God. You could say, well, God's perfect. You don't have to worry about it. The Vedas, you can still follow your Vedic rituals because they're still expressed in the Vedas, and the Vedas come forth from God. So don't worry. But they're not even happy with that. They don't want anything to interfere with the absoluteness of the Veda. So they don't even say they were created. They don't accept creative cycles. They just say it's an eternal Veda with its instructions, and those instructions are eternal for all time, beginningless and endless. We always have to do our Vedic rituals. They're real ritualists. And that sounds like a simplistic argument. They were powerful philosophers. That may sound like a difficult thing to defend. They defended that. They were some of the best philosophers of ancient India. It's not often philosophy. It's not really about your position. It's about how brilliant you are. If you're really brilliant, you can defend anything, and you can run circles around your opponents. And that's why that's another reason why Vedanta says, we can't rely on human reason, because it's not the argument that wins in a debate. It's the intellectual power of the proponent, of a particular opponent, propounder of an argument. There's truth to that. So Mimamsas then are against God. They don't like the idea that there's a God, even a God that speaks the Veda, their beloved Veda. It comes from God. You think that'd be good enough, right? It comes from God. Oh, so it must be perfect. They're not even happy with that. They don't want the Veda to come from anywhere. They want it to be eternal. And why? Because the Vedas contain the information about how to perform the rituals, the hymns to chant, the Brahmana texts. We don't have to get into the different kinds of texts, but the texts of interest to them are those that insist that the various sacrifices have to be performed, right? Daily ones, occasional ones, and like seasonal ones. There's a daily one. There's 3 kinds of sacrifice. There's a nimitta, ones you do every day. There's the ones prescribed, like the full moon or whatever it might be. And then there's ones that are optional, like you want a child, then you optionally you can do sacrifice, 3 different kinds. But for them, the world is perpetuated by sacrifice and nothing else. All right, my friends, so we're going to be looking at the Shlokavartika, Kumarila, and his arguments against Ishvara in the next recording. And then we're going to have, I forget the order, but we'll have one from the Jains that will be given by a guest lecturer, 2 from the Buddhists, and then we have our Matthew Dusty was giving us a short exposition from Nyāya, the logicians. We'll get to after the non-theist, after the next 2 weeks. We'll go back to the Hindu traditions, the Ishvara traditions, and we'll look at Nyāya's rational arguments. I think we have 5 anti-Ishvara sessions. 2 Buddhist, 1 Jain, 1 Mimamsa, and 1 from the Yukta Deepika. I think there's a Sāṃkhya one. A Sāṃkhya one, as I recall. All right. So I hope we're all doing well. I hope nobody regrets taking this course and that you're appreciating, engaging this particular aspect of Indian philosophy, this debate around the existence, why we should accept there's a God or not, right? Next 2 weeks, we'll get reasons why we should not, why it's incoherent to think there's a personal God, right? It's the next 5 sessions. Have a great afternoon, everybody, or evening or morning, depending on when you listen to this. Namaskar.